In this video, we are going to look at how to get data in Power BI from an API. So, the reason I want to make this video is because I do get questions in DMs and emails regarding how I get data for a specific report. And it's the report that you can see here. This is an FPL report, so Fantasy Premier League report. But it doesn't matter. The point is we're going to get data from an API, and also we're going to look at how to loop through multiple web pages using a parameter. So, how are we going to do that? First of all, the APIs we're looking at essentially are two endpoints. The first one is this one, which as you can see is just a whole list of information, as APIs tend to be. And the other is this one. So one is going to give us basically a table of one row for each player. And this second one here is going to give us information based on the history of that player and the future. So performance in things that have happened and also the fixtures that are going to happen in the future. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to take this URL as our first API endpoint, and we're going to bring that into Power BI simply using get data and web. That's all we need to do. Just take the URL, paste it in Power BI. You have this advanced option. You don't need any of that. Simply basic, and then OK. And that will read the URL that you've given, and then come back with, well, it'll come back with what it'll come back with. We'll see that in a second. So what are we looking at now? It's read that, and it's given you something which doesn't look too helpful, to be quite honest. So in this particular API, every API is a bit different in what it returns. But in this particular API, I'm going to go back to the very top, ignore the next three steps, and we're going to look and to see what we actually want from this API endpoint. Well, in this case, it's given us options, and what we need are the elements. The elements are the names of the players, essentially. You can click on each one if you want to see what they are, but in this case, we're going to use elements. I'm going to click on list, and you're going to continue. And the reason you could ignore the steps that we had before is because when you do that, it deletes the next steps because it's dealing with a whole different thing now. So as you can see here, we have 593 items, and it's done as a list. So you can click on table and just click on OK here, how to handle extra columns, show us errors. And then now that you have your table, you can expand this out. So as you can see, you click on each record and it actually tells you what's in there. So you can see the name of the player, all this type of stuff. What you actually want to do is just click on these two little arrows, and it's going to expand that out, and it's going to ask you which of the columns you actually want to expand out. You don't have to do it for all of them. In this case, we're just going to expand them all out. I'm going to remove this because I don't like it, and click on OK. And that's what you have. So now you've actually just gone to the API and you've taken data and you've now loaded that into Power Query, and you can do your bits of data transformation, change column names, change data types and what have you. But yeah, so that's the very first part, and it's the easiest part. What we now need to do is something different. So you'll notice before when we were expanding the columns out, which I mentioned, we had one here called ID. Yeah. So if we go to ID, we can just discuss what we're going to do as a next step. I'm going to choose columns, go to column and go to ID. And there it is, ID. So for the next steps, we need this ID. Yeah, we need to provide the API with an ID to get data. So what I mean by that is this. So in this particular endpoint, what we need to do is we need to provide the ID of a player, because we have one page per player. Not like this one where it's all packed together in one page. This one is one page per player. So our next step is going to take this and create something that's going to allow us to loop through every single one of those players without having, of course, to create 593 queries, which would be just unmanageable. You'd have to create them as a new player arrives. It's not doable. What this one does, the first query, not only does it give us information, but it also gives us a dynamic list of every single player that exists. Whether added or removed, it will be added or removed from this list, which is very cool. So what are we going to do? We're going to start by creating a regular web query like we did the first time. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to go new query, and I'm going to go on web. And I put my URL in there, and I click on OK, and we do something very similar to what we did the first time. Again, it's going to go through the applied steps, and we don't want to have these two, so we just go to the top one. It gives us options, fixtures, history, or history past. I'm going to click on history, and you can see straight away it says here 3 records. So if I click on the list and go yes, I want to continue, and again convert the table, okay, and now I can expand those records out, and you'll see straight away that I have the element is the ID of the player, and we have information based on each fixture, how many points they scored, how many minutes they played, the stats for each fixture. So not only do we have the sum of all of those things in the first query, which I'm going to name now player data, so I don't have to say first query. And on this one, like I say, this is a breakdown of week by week. So what we have now is the basis for what we're going to use to create our parameter. How are we going to do that? Now, there's probably a couple of ways of doing this. My preferred way is actually to use the advanced editor and type it directly in there. Why? Well, I think because it's what I've always done, to be honest, but also I think it's nice because it kind of gets you used to understanding and seeing the advanced editor, and also there are a couple of things that you can do in here that allow you to let this data refresh using the Power BI service. So I'll explain what I mean. So first of all, the advanced editor. If you've never used it before, don't worry. It looks very intimidating, but it's not. My tip would be this. If you're a bit scared of touching it, because if you make a mistake, you can break everything, simply copy and paste it somewhere, and then you don't have to be scared anymore. See, I've copied and pasted that. So if I make a mistake, if I mess it up, I have it here in this notepad, and I can just paste it back in. No worries. What we're going to do with this is change it up just a little bit so it becomes our parameter which we can use to loop through. Bear with me, all will become clear. So I'll start off by getting rid of all of this, by which I mean moving it down, because it just makes it easier to understand what we're actually dealing with, because none of this we're going to change. Not a thing. All of this is going to remain exactly what it is, and what we are dealing with is just this top section here. And what we need to do is we need to create something that gets rid of this 1, because we don't want to say 1. We want to say whatever value that I input. So I'm going to change this, and I'm going to say player as text, and then I'm going to go as table, because what we're doing is we're creating the creation of a table. I always forget this part. Yeah, that's right. So we're going to input a player value here. It's going to be a text value, and that's going to be the creation of a table. So we've done this part, but now we need to do this part as well. So I'm going to put a quotation mark there, which means this part is now a static. This part, I'm just going to move a row down to make it clear as well. And then I'm going to go here, I'm going to go square bracket, I'm going to create relative path. Now, this part isn't actually necessary for the parameter part, but it is necessary for the allowing of a query that can be refreshed via a gateway in the cloud. If you don't do this part, you always have to manually refresh it, which is very annoying. We don't want that. So we go relative path, and then we go equals, and then we do another quotation equals API. It's going to give me a little error here because I forgot to put a comma there. Commas, very important, no? And element summary, and then I'm going to go here like that. I'm going to get rid of my one. I'm going to go and player and this, and then I'm going to do that. So I made this in quotation marks completely because that is a static. I've put this relative path in. This is also a static, and this now, this is where I remove the number. So instead of saying just one, it's element summary and player, the table that I create here, and this /, which is important because if it doesn't have a /, it doesn't work. And then I closed off the square bracket that I started here, and that was it. So might seem like a lot, is not. It might take a few times to practice. Once you've done it a few times, it'll be just like nothing. And that's what we do. So this works to looping through APIs. Basically, it's quite standard in APIs that it'll give you a table and say, this table contains the IDs, this table you need to input an ID, and this is how you use that. And if you've got it right, well, you can test to see if you've got it right. First of all, you click on done and you cross your fingers, press your thumbs if you live in Germany. That's a good start. So now it's no longer a table, yeah? It is a place where we can enter a parameter. So I'm going to enter a 1, see what happens. Beautiful. That's what we want to happen. Because now that is my query 2, and whatever I enter in there, it creates a table based on what I've entered. So that works. We can just delete those because obviously what we don't want is to have to manually enter that. That makes no sense. So what we want to do now is to say, okay, I have this table which one contains my IDs. I want to create another table, yeah, which is defined, which is created through only using the ID, yeah. So now, if I just take this, I'm going to duplicate it, and this part here, where I expanded the column, just going to double click on the little cog. And instead of saying take everything, I'm going to say just give me the ID. That's all I want is the ID. I'm going to change this to text because I did specify text. And now I'm going to be bold and call this player history. Player game week history maybe. And I've given it that name, so hopefully this works. Now we're going to add a column, and we're going to invoke a custom function, which is that. So now add column, invoke custom function, and the function query is going to be query 2. Let's give it a better name before we do that. It's going to be game week. Can't type function. So again, go here. Now I'm going to go invoke custom function, function query, game week function. So exactly. So now we have to select which column we're going to use. Now we only have one column, so great. I can click on OK, and then we see what happens. If we've done it correctly, what we should now do is have for each one, we should have a table, which is what we do have. Yes. What we also want to do now is check this. because if there are differences in the data, you'll have some errors, which is perfectly fine. You just need to investigate what those errors are. Here we have 590 has an error. So if we go back to our API, the actual URL, we type in here 590, and what we'll see is that this player has no game week history. So it has no columns, which is a problem. So all we need to do in this case is go remove errors, and they will disappear. Obviously, that's depending on what your errors are. In this case, we know that those errors occur because there is no data. So as soon as the data does appear, that person plays a game, then the error will disappear, and that person will then be included within our game week history. No problem. So if you have an error, investigate what it is, and then perform the appropriate action. So expand it out. Again, you can basically just take all of them. I would suggest you don't use ID perhaps, because we already have the ID, but there is nothing that says ID, so whatever. Actually, it's element. So I'm going to remove element because that would be the same information twice. I'm going to click on OK. And then what you'll see is we have 3 rows for each ID, because each player, or most players, have 3 weeks of game week history. So instead of here we have 1 row for 1 ID. Here we're going to have 1 row of ID for each time they have played a game of football or existed within fantasy football. And that's it. That is how you take data from an API and then loop through multiple functions. We'll do it one more time, because there is another table that we can use. So actually it uses exactly the same endpoint. So if we take this one again, actually no, we'll do it a different way. We're going to start from the very start. We're going to go back to our API, and again we're going to use element summary. I'm going to use 1 again, and this time, just to really show how it works again, I'm going to go new query, web 1. Now the reason I'm doing the same thing is because with this particular API, you get to choose what data you're taking. So before I took my game week history, and now I'm going to take the future fixtures. It's pretty much identical process, but it just helps to repeat what we've done so we can see how it works. I'm going to go to source. So before I took history, now I'm going to take fixtures, click list, yep, continue, convert it to table, and then go do that. Expand it and go OK. Beautiful. That's the fixtures for that particular player. So again, what we're going to do, I'm going to quickly change the name here so I don't forget this time, and I'm going to call it fixtures function, and I'll go into my advanced editor. So exactly the same as last time. What we're going to do, we're going to say none of this stuff is important because we're only interested in this part here. That's all we're interested in. So what do we do? Same thing as before. We're going to go open a bracket, player as text. You don't have to call it player, by the way. I'm calling it player because you can call it ID as text. Anything is text, really. It's just the name of the table. As long as what you write here is also what you reference here, you can call it whatever you want. Up to you. Whatever makes you happy. Do that. So now this is there on its own, just like that. Beautiful. And yep, put my comma there, which is what I always forget to do. And here I'm going to go my relative path equals like that. And here I'm going to go and. So what I'm left with is just this part, this one. The one has to go. And I'm going to go and, excuse me, and player. Hopefully that'll work, unless I've made a terrible mistake. Oh, I have made a terrible mistake because what did I forget to do? I forgot to write as table. That's why it wasn't working, because I didn't specify what it was. I was wondering why it wasn't working correctly before, because I forgot the as table. And the reason I saw was a bit strange is because when you type this again here, it should recognize that it's a table and that should appear, and it didn't. And I was thinking, what's going wrong? And I was going wrong. So that should now, I always say should because I'm never particularly confident. That should now work, and this should now also be a function. You go done. So far, so good. We tested. I always tested. Why not? So I type in 1, and as you can see, it gives me 35 rows. So now if you think we've got 592 players, and on this one, for each of those 592 players, we're going to have 35 rows. And some quick maths, that is quite a few. Yeah. So it might take a bit for loading, but nothing huge. It's not like it's big data or anything, but it's a fair few thousand rows. So what am I going to do? I'm going to again do exactly what I did the first time. I'm going to duplicate this one, put it here. I'm going to go this time to here. I'm just going to go delete until the end. Get rid of these ones that we don't want because we have our ID. And again, I'm going to add column, invoke custom function. And this time I have 2, so I have to choose the correct one. Not game week function. I want fixtures function. And I want to use column ID. And the reason it hasn't done that one, I'm going to click on OK, and it's going to give me an error, but it's fixable. No worries. Error. Why an error? Because I said as text, and I'm not using text. So to fix that, I'm just going to go one step back, change it to text, insert, and then it should work. It might take a second because it's got a lot of data to read. Like I said, 592 times 25. But there it is. And I'm going to expand that. I'm going to take everything, but other than the ID. Well, we'll just look at that first. We can have a look to make sure it's the same ID. Here. See, I kept the ID in. It's called ID, but actually this is a different ID. So it's a good thing I kept that. So here, player ID, different ID. So anyway, lots of data, and you can see that for each player we have 35 rows, and we can call that fixtures. Not gixtures, but rather fixtures. So now we have our fixtures, our player data, and our game week history, all done by looping through the websites based on that ID. And when we load that data into Power BI, we can create relationships between these 3 tables using the ID. So we have one ID in our player data, which is essentially like a fact table, if you will. And this one is the history, which is going to show how they performed on a week-by-week basis. And the fixtures is going to show us what they're going to be doing in the future. And that's it. So a little bit of FPL, a little bit of how to hit APIs, and a little bit of how to loop through multiple pages using an iterator. Hope that helped. Hope it was clear. I again understand that there are different ways of doing this, of creating your parameters, but this is how I prefer to do it. I like to use the advanced editor, and I think it's important to get in there a little bit and not be scared of it, because you can do more with the advanced editor than you can just by clicking on the buttons provided here in Power Query Editor. So that was it. thank you very much. Hope you learned something. Any comments as to something that wasn't clear or something that you think can be done a different way or a better way, as ever, write it in the comments. And yeah, if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more, click subscribe, and take care and goodbye.